Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you, honey." I stepped into the private room and saw the trap immediately. There were no menus. Instead, a thick stack of papers sat beside a man in a suit who watched me like a predator. My mother smiled, the chillingly sweet way she does before locking a door from the outside. She said, "If I just sign, everything will be fair for the family." I counted them like chess pieces and realized this was an ambush. "My name is Kylie Barnes," and the moment I stepped across the threshold of the private dining room at the upscale restaurant in Uptown Charlotte, I knew I had made a tactical error. Or perhaps, more accurately, I had walked knowingly into a slaughterhouse disguised as a family reunion. The air inside the room was different from the bustling main dining area we had just left behind. Out there it was the low hum of expensive conversations and the clinking of silverware on china. In here, the silence was heavy, pressurized, like the cabin of an airplane right before the oxygen masks drop. The lighting was the first giveaway. It was too bright. Restaurants like this usually favored ambient, warm glows that flattered complexions and forgave wrinkles. But the overhead lights in this windowless room were dialed up to a clinical intensity, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows against the cream-cold walls. It felt less like a place to eat stripped steak and more like a room where you would be asked to confess to a crime you had not yet committed. I scanned the table. There were no menus. There were no wine glasses. There was no bread basket. Instead, the center of the mahogany table was dominated by a single thick stack of paperwork. Beside it lay a heavy fountain pen capped and positioned with military precision, parallel to the edge of the document. It was not my pen. I never used fountain pens. They were messy and pretentious. Two things my father Evan had taught me to despise. My eyes drifted to the header of the document, visible even from where I stood near the door. The words were printed in bold, sans serif font family settlement agreement. And right below that, in a font size that screamed for attention, was my own name. I looked up to find the architect of this scene waiting for me. My mother, Denise Holloway, sat at the head of the table. She was wearing her armor, a tailored beige blazer that probably cost more than my first car, and her hair was coiffed into that immovable, perfect helmet she adorned whenever she wanted to control a narrative. She was smiling, but it was not the smile of a mother seeing her daughter after a month of silence. It was the tight, practiced smile of a real estate agent trying to close a deal on a house with a cracking foundation. It was a smile that stopped at the teeth. To her right sat Grant, her husband of 10 years. Grant Holloway was a man who took up too much space, both physically and conversationally. He was wearing a navy suit that strained slightly at the shoulders. His face flushed with that permanent low-grade aggression he masked as assertiveness. He did not look at me. He was staring at the paperwork, his jaw set, his hands clasped on the table like a sledgehammer waiting to swing. Further down were the spectators, Sienna, 19 years old, and Logan, 17 years old, my step-siblings. They looked like hostages. Sienna was staring specifically at a knot in the wood of the table, her shoulders hunched, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. Logan looked bored but tense, his leg bouncing rhythmically under the table, creating a vibration I could feel through the floorboards. They were not here to participate. They were here to provide moral weight to be the silent guilt trip that Denise would weaponize later. Look at your brother and sister. Kylie, do it for them. But there was a fifth person, a stranger. He sat on the opposite side, a silver laptop open in front of him. He was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that produced generic corporate sharks. His suit was a little too shiny, his hair a little too gelled, and his smile a little too ready. He looked like the kind of person who sold catastrophic injury insurance over the phone. "Kylie," my mother said, her voice smooth and devoid of any real warmth. "Sit down, sweetheart. We have some things to discuss." I did not sit immediately. I remained standing, keeping my hand near the door handle for a second longer than necessary. "I thought this was dinner, Mom, to celebrate your promotion." "It is a celebration," Grant said, his voice booming in the small acoustic trap of the room. "A celebration of the future. Sit down, Kylie." I pulled out the chair directly across from the document. It felt scripted. They had left this specific seat open, forcing me to face the tribunal. I sat, placing my purse on the floor and my phone on the table, face down. "Who is this?" I asked, nodding toward the man with the laptop. "This is Carter Baines," Denise said, gesturing with a flutter of her hand. "He is a family attorney. He has been helping us organize things since your father passed." Carter Baines extended a hand across the table. I did not take it. He did not seem offended. He simply retracted it and rested his elbows on the polished wood, interlacing his fingers. "Pleasure to meet you, MS. Barnes," Carter said. His voice was like warm syrup, sticky and overly sweet. "I know this is a difficult time for you. Losing a father is a tragedy that reshapes one's world. I am here to help make that transition as seamless as possible." "Seamless," I repeated. "Is that what we are calling it?" "We want to talk about the estate." Grant cut in impatient. He tapped a finger on the stack of papers. "Your father left things messy, disorganized. He did not think about the long-term tax implications for the whole family unit. We are just trying to clean it up." I felt a flash of cold anger in my chest. My father, Evan Barnes, was a systems engineer. He categorized his grocery receipts by aisle. He had a spreadsheet for his sock rotation. The idea that he had left anything messy was a lie so blatant it was almost insulting. "What is the paperwork, Mom?" I asked, ignoring Grant and looking directly at Denise. She sighed, a tragic theatrical sound. "It is a solution, Kylie, a way to ensure fairness. Your father, he had certain assets, but if we leave them scattered the way they are, the government takes a chunk, the lawyers take a chunk, and nobody wins. Carter has drawn up a family settlement agreement. It consolidates everything." Carter cleared his throat and turned his laptop slightly so I could see a graph that meant absolutely nothing. "Essentially, MS. Barnes, this agreement creates a family legacy trust. It is a very standard, very civilized instrument. By signing this, you agree to transfer the bulk of the probate assets, roughly 60 to 70% into the trust." I stared at him. 60 to 70%, I said, repeating the number slowly to make sure I had heard it correctly. "Managed by your mother and Grant." Of course, Carter added quickly. "They have the experience in real estate and investment. It pulls the resources. It protects the capital. And naturally you, Sienna, and Logan are all beneficiaries. It ensures that everyone is taken care of equally." "Equally," I said. I looked at Sienna. She still had not looked up. My father was not Sienna and Logan's father. Why would his retirement accounts go into a pot for them? "We are a family," Denise snapped, her mask cracking for a fraction of a second. "God, Kylie, do you have to be so transactional?" Evan raised them for half their lives. "Do you think he would want Sienna to drown in student debt while you sit on a pile of cash you did not earn?" "He set up college funds for them," I said quietly. "I saw the files. Mom, he was generous." "This is not about college. It is about the future," Grant rumbled. "It is about leverage. We can use that capital to invest, flip properties, multiply the value. If you keep it in those stagnant index funds, it dies. We are offering to work for you, Kylie. We are offering to grow your money." "And if I want to manage my own money?" I asked. The room went silent. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to get louder. Carter stopped smiling. Grant leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing. Denise picked up a glass of water and took a slow sip, her eyes over the rim fixed on me like a sniper scope. "That would be unwise," Carter said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the syrup and gaining an edge of steel. "Why?" I asked. "Because the probate process is public, MS. Barnes," Carter said. He tapped a key on his laptop. "If you refuse to settle amicably, things get complicated. We would have to contest the current distribution. We would have to file motions questioning the validity of the final will based on mental competency toward the end." My blood ran cold. He died in a car accident. He was perfectly sane. He was under stress, Denise said softly. He was erratic. "Kylie, you know that we have emails. We have texts." And Carter continued, "Contesting a will freezes the assets for months, maybe years. The legal fees would drain the estate significantly. By the time you actually saw a dime, it would be a fraction of what is on the table now. Plus, the litigation becomes public record. Your credit score could take a hit if debts are not serviced during the freeze. Your background checks for your remote tech job might flag the ongoing litigation. It is a mess, Kylie. A very expensive, very public mess. It was a shakedown, pure and simple. They were threatening to burn the house down if I did not give them the keys. They knew I prided myself on my independence, on my clean financial record, something my father had drilled into me. They were weaponizing his lessons against me. So, Grant said, leaning forward again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the choice is yours. You sign the paper. We order dinner and we toast to the family. You walk away with 30% of a growing pie and no headaches. Or you walk out and we let the lawyers eat the carcass. I looked at the pen. It was amlike, expensive, heavy. It was a prop just like everything else in this room, just like the family dynamic my mother was trying to sell. I looked at Denise. She looked expectant, as if she had just offered me a kidney and was waiting for a thank you card. I looked at Grant, who looked like a FUD in a suit. I looked at Sienna and Logan, who looked like they wanted to dissolve into the floor. And I looked at Carter, the mercenary hired to pull the trigger. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of stale coffee and expensive perfume. 1, I said aloud. Grant blinked. Excuse me. 2, I said, looking at Grant. 3, I said, looking at Sienna. 4, I said, looking at Logan. 5, I said, landing on Carter. I leaned back in my chair, allowing a small, cold smile to touch my lips. It was the first time I had smiled since I entered the room. It felt good. It felt like armor. That is a lot of people, I said softly. 5 against 1. You really brought an entire audience for this. We brought the family, Denise said, her voice tight. Stop being dramatic. Kylie, pick up the pen. You know, I said. Dad told me once that if someone tries to force you to sign a contract without letting you read it for 24 hours, it is because the contract is a lie. He also said that if you have to threaten someone to get a deal, you have already lost. Evan is dead, Grant said brutally. This is the real world. Yes, I agreed. It is. I reached for my phone. Grant twitched as if he thought I was going to record them or throw it, but I just turned it over. The screen lit up, illuminating the notification of a draft message I had prepared 20 minutes ago while I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, watching them all walk in. I did not unlock the phone. I did not open an app. I just tapped the screen once to wake it and then pressed the send button on the notification that was waiting there. It was a single word, one syllable, that would bring the ceiling down on this little theater production. Now I placed the phone back on the table face up this time. What are you doing? Denise asked, her voice shrill. Who are you texting? I am not texting anyone, I said calmly, crossing my legs. I am inviting the rest of the party. The door behind me did not just open. It swung inward with the decisive weight of authority. The heavy oak slammed against the door's stock with a sound like a gunshot, causing Sienna to jump in her seat and Carter to snap his laptop shut instinctively. The air in the room shifted instantly. The pressure did not leave. It just changed direction. My mother looked up, her eyes widening in genuine confusion. Grant stood up halfway, his face re-inning. Who the hell is that? Grant demanded. I did not turn around. I did not have to. I knew exactly who was standing there, and I knew exactly what was in the folder she was carrying. You brought a lawyer, I said to Grant, my voice steady, matching the low hum of the room. So did I. I looked at the Mont Blanc pen on the table. It looked ridiculous now, a toy for a child. You mentioned fairness, Mom. I said, let us talk about what is actually fair. I watched Carter Baines. He was the only one who seemed to realize the gravity of what had just happened. He was looking at the space behind me, and for the first time, the slick insurance salesman veneer was gone. In its place was the distinct pale look of a man who realizes he has brought a knife to a drone strike. This is a private meeting, Denise hissed, looking past me. You have no right to barge in here. Actually, I said, I think she has every right, considering she is the executive of the estate you are trying to steal. I picked up the glass of water that had been sitting in front of me. The ice had melted, leaving the water lukewarm. I took a sip. It tasted like victory. Shall we begin? I asked to understand why I was the only person in that private dining room who was not sweating. You have to go back to a kitchen table in Matthews, North Carolina, about 20 years ago. It was a sturdy oak table scratched from years of homework and spilled cereal. Sitting in a house that was perfectly average, we had a two-car garage, a lawn that was mostly green, and a mortgage that my father, Evan Barnes, attacked with the ferocity of a starving wolf. My childhood was split into two distinct operating systems. On one side was my mother, Denise. For her, reality was a draft that could always be edited. She did not just want to live. She wanted to be perceived, even before social media became the monster it is today. My mother was curating her life for an invisible audience. She was the woman who would buy organic strawberries she could not afford, arrange them in a ceramic bowl for a dinner party to impress the neighbors, and then complain for 3 weeks that we had to cut back on electricity to balance the books. She was allergic to being average, even though our bank account was aggressively middle class. On the other side was my father. Evan was a systems engineer, and he viewed the world through the lens of structural integrity. He was a man who kept every receipt he had ever received in a filing cabinet organized by fiscal quarter. He hated debt the way most people hate disease. To him, a flashy car was not a status symbol. It was a depreciating asset that leaked money in insurance and maintenance. I remember the night the war between them finally went nuclear. I was 9 years old, sitting at the top of the stairs, listening to voices bounce off the laminate flooring below. My mother wanted to move. She had found a house in a new development called the Oaks or the Pines, some generic aspirational name that promised a lifestyle we did not have. It was 5 bedrooms, 4 baths, and cost 3 times what our current home was worth. I can still hear her voice, pitched high and desperate. She said we needed it. She said her friends were moving up. She said I needed a better environment to grow up in. My father's voice was lower, calm, but immovable. He laid out the math. He explained that with the interest rates and the property taxes, we would be house poor within 6 months. He told her that he was not going to sign a 30-year contract to impress people we did not even like. My mother screamed that he had no ambition. She said he was content to be small. My father replied with a sentence I never forgot. He said that life is not a magazine cover. Denise, you cannot eat prestige. They divorced 2 years later. When the dust settled, the custody arrangement was standard on paper, but in practice, I gravitated toward the quiet stability of my father's house. My mother moved into a condo she could barely afford, decorating it with furniture bought on credit cards, trying to signal to the world that she was thriving. My father stayed in the house in Matthews, paid off the mortgage 4 years early, and drove a sedan until the odometer read 200,000 M. Living with Evan Barnes was not a childhood filled with whimsical surprises or trips to Disney World. It was a masterclass in survival. While other kids were learning how to ride bikes, my father was teaching me how to read a bank statement. Every Sunday night, we had what he called the review. We would sit at that scratched oak table, and he would open his laptop. He showed me the electric bill. He showed me the grocery costs. He explained what compound interest was and why it could be your best friend or your executioner. He was not cold. He was just terrified of the world taking advantage of me. He loved me by arming me. I remember when I turned 18, just before I left for college, he handed me a credit card with a $500 limit. He looked me in the eye and told me that this piece of plastic was a test. He said that if I carried a balance for even 1 month, he would cancel it. He told me that a credit score is the only report card that matters when you are an adult because it determines where you can sleep, what you can drive, and who will hire you. That the most important lesson, the one that saved me in the restaurant room with Carter Baines, came when I was buying my first used car after graduation. The dealer was pushing me, telling me the offer was only good for the next hour, trying to get me to sign for an extended warranty I did not need. I called my dad in a panic. He told me to leave. He said that if anyone tries to force you to sign something by creating a false sense of urgency, it is because they are hiding something. He said, honest deals can wait until the morning. Scams need to be signed by midnight. While I was learning the architecture of financial independence, my mother was building a new facade. She met Grant Holloway 3 years after the divorce. Grant was everything my father was not. He was loud, he was expansive, and he was in real estate investment, which seemed to involve a lot of seminars, leased luxury SUVs, and talk about leverage. Grant was the kind of man who tipped bait when people were watching, but complained about the service when the waiter walked away. They got married in a ceremony that cost more than my 4 years of college tuition. Then came Sienna, and 2 years later, Logan. They built the perfect family image. They bought the big house in the neighborhood with the HOA that fined you if your grass was half an inch too high. They went on vacations to resorts where they took hundreds of photos and posted them with captions about being blessed. I became the cameo character in their show. I was the daughter from the previous marriage, the one who was doing tech stuff somewhere in the city. I was useful to them. I was proof that Denise was a good mother who raised successful children. I was invited to Thanksgiving and Christmas, not because they wanted to hear about my life, but because the family photo looked incomplete without me. I was a prop to round out the aesthetic. I played along for years. I went to the dinners. I brought gifts for Sienna and Logan. I smiled when Grant made passive-aggressive jokes about how engineers were boring and how the real money was in sales. I bit my tongue because I loved my half-siblings, even if they were being raised in a greenhouse of toxic positivity. But as I climbed the ladder in my career, earning a senior position and a salary that finally allowed me to breathe, the dynamic shifted. My mother developed a radar for my bank account. The calls started innocently enough. It was never a demand. It was always a crisis. Grant is having a slow month with the market. She would say, "C needs braces and we want her to have the best orthodontist, not the cheap one. Logan has a chance to go to this elite soccer camp and it would break his heart if he missed out." She never asked me to give them money. She asked me to help the family. She weaponized my success against me. She made me feel that my stability was an insult to their struggles. If I said no, I was selfish. If I asked why Grant could not pay for it, I was being disrespectful to the man who stepped up to be a father figure, a title Grant had never actually earned. I started sending checks. $500 here, $1,000 there. It was the peace tax, the price I paid to keep my mother from crying on the phone and accusing me of abandoning my flesh and blood. My father watched this from a distance. He never criticized me for it, but I could see the tightness in his jaw whenever I mentioned helping Mom out about 6 months before the accident. Dad asked me to come over for dinner, just the two of us. He made lasagna, his specialty, which mostly involved buying the best frozen one he could find and adding extra cheese. We ate in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had watched his marriage dissolve. He looked tired. His hair had gone fully gray, and the lines around his eyes were deeper. He was still working, still saving, still driving that ancient sedan. He put down his fork and looked at me with a seriousness that made me pause. He asked me if I knew where his important papers were. I told him I did, in the fireproof safe in the study top shelf. He nodded. He told me that he had made some updates. He said he had seen a new lawyer, a woman named Marisol Vieger. He said he wanted to make sure things were airtight. I asked him why. Was he sick? Was something wrong? He shook his head and smiled, a rare soft expression. He said he was fine. He was just running a system update. He told me that he knew Denise better than anyone. He knew Grant. He knew that people who live on leverage eventually run out of road, and when they do, they look for any resource they can liquidate. He told me he had worked for 40 years to build a foundation. He did not do it so Grant Holloway could flip it into a condo project that would go bankrupt in 6 months. He did not do it so Denise could buy a new wardrobe for her next social climb. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His hand was rough, calloused from weekend yard work. He told me that the money he was leaving was not a lottery win. It was freedom. It was the ability to walk away from a bad job. It was the ability to leave a bad relationship. It was the power to say no. I remember feeling a lump in my throat. I told him he was going to live to be 100, that he was too stubborn to die. He laughed. He said he planned on it, but the data suggests a 100% mortality rate for human beings, so it was best to be prepared. That was the last real conversation we had about money. He never told me the specifics of the new will. He never told me how much was in the accounts. He just told me where the key was. When the police called me on that rainy Tuesday night to tell me about the pileup I-77, my world shattered. The grief was a physical weight pressing the air out of my lungs. I went through the motions of the funeral, the burial, the reception, where my mother played the role of the devastated widow perfectly, despite having been divorced from him for 15 years. She hugged people she did not know. She cried loudly near the casket. She told stories about their early years that I knew were exaggerated. Grant stood by her side, looking solemn, acting the part of the supportive patriarch. I stood in the back numb. I felt like an orphan. Even though my mother was standing 20 feet away, the only parent who had ever really seen me, who had ever really understood me, was gone. But as I watched Denise and Grant at the funeral, I noticed something. Amidst the tears and the hugs, there was a sharpness in their eyes. They were not just mourning, they were calculating. I saw Grant whispering to my mother, and I saw her nod, her eyes darting toward me and then away. I did not know it then, but the clock had already started ticking. They assumed I was just Evan's daughter, a girl who would be emotional, overwhelmed, and easy to maneuver. They thought I was a child who needed the adults to take over. They forgot who raised me. They forgot that I was the girl who sat at the table for the review every Sunday. They forgot that I knew how to read the fine print. And most importantly, they forgot the last thing my father said to me that night over lasagna. He had walked me to my car, hugged me tight, and looked me in the eye. He said, "Kylie, never let anyone guilt you into lighting yourself on fire to keep them warm. You do not owe anyone your future just because you share a last name." Sitting in that restaurant staring at the 5 people waiting for me to surrender, I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing next to me. I was not going to sign. I was going to fight, and I was going to do it exactly the way he would have wanted, with cold, hard evidence and zero emotion. The call came at 11:14 on a Tuesday night. It was raining, that heavy, relentless Carolina downpour that turns the interstate into a sleek black mirror. I was in my apartment, folding laundry and watching a documentary about deep-sea exploration, completely unaware that my life was being rewritten in the dark on I-77. The voice on the other end was professional, detached, and apologetic. It was a state trooper. He told me there had been an accident near the Tavola Road exit. A semi-truck had hydroplaned. My father's sedan was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was quick, the trooper said, as if the speed of the impact was a consolation prize for the fact that my father was never coming home. There was no cinematic rush to the hospital. There was no holding his hand while he whispered final words of wisdom. There was just a drive to the medical examiner's office the next morning to identify a body that looked like my father, but felt like an empty room. The silence of death is not peaceful. It is deafening. It screams at you that the person who taught you how to tie your shoes and balance a checkbook is now just paperwork. The funeral took place 4 days later. My father had requested a simple service, no open casket, no expensive flowers, just a cremation and a small gathering. He hated waste. He would have been appalled if I had spent $10,000 on a mahogany box to bury in the ground. But Denise Holloway does not do simple. My mother arrived at the funeral home like she was auditioning for the role of the grieving widow in a daytime soap opera. She wore a black dress that was tasteful yet noticeably expensive, and she clung to Grant's arm as if she could not stand under her own power. When she saw me, she let out a sob that turned every head in the room. "Oh, Kylie," she wailed, pulling me into a hug that smelled of Chanel and hairspray. "My poor baby. We are all so devastated." I stood there, stiff as a board, letting her perform. I looked over her shoulder and saw Sienna and Logan standing awkwardly by the entrance. They looked genuinely sad, their eyes red and puffy. They had liked Evan. He had been kind to them in his distant, quiet way. But Denise, she had spent the last 15 years complaining about him, calling him cheap, boring, and small-minded. Yet here she was accepting condolences from my father's old engineering colleagues, nodding tragically as she told them how much they had been through together. She was rewriting history in real time. She was positioning herself not as the ex-wife who left him for a bigger house, but as the co-parent who shared his life's journey. Grant stood beside her, shaking hands with a serenity that felt practiced. He was scouting the room. I could see his eyes flicking over the attendees, assessing who they were, gauging the value of the crowd. When he looked at me, his expression was a mix of pity and impatience. After the service, while I was trying to talk to one of my father's neighbors about his garden, Denise cornered me. "We need to make sure we handle the estate properly," she whispered, her hand gripping my forearm a little too tightly. "Grant knows a great probate guy. He can take this burden off your shoulders. Sweetie, you do not need to worry about the paperwork." I pulled my arm away gently. "I have it covered." "Fine." She blinked, her eyes hardening for a microsecond. "We just want to help. Kylie, do not be stubborn like him." I walked away before I said something that would cause a scene. I buried my father that day, but I also buried the last shred of hope that my mother would ever just be a mother rather than an operator. 2 days after the funeral, I met Mara Speger. My father had mentioned her name, but I had never met her. Her office was in a brick building in Dwarth, quiet and understated. Marisol was a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She did not offer me platitudes. She offered me water and a thick binder. "Your father was a very meticulous man," Marisol said, opening the file. "He came to me 3 years ago to restructure his estate. He updated it again 6 months ago. He was very specific about his intentions." She laid out the assets. It was not a fortune that would make the news. There were no hidden offshore accounts or gold bars. It was the accumulation of 40 years of discipline. There was the house in Matthews fully paid off. There was a 401k that had been growing since the 80s. There was a brokerage account filled with boring, reliable index funds. There was a modest life insurance policy. When Marisol slid the paper across the desk with the total valuation, I stared at the number. It was significant. It was enough to pay off my own student loans, put a down payment on a house, and still have a safety net that would last for decades if managed correctly. It was exactly what he had promised, freedom. Marisol leaned forward, clasping her hands on the desk. "Kylie, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said. I looked up, tearing my eyes away from the numbers. "Your father was worried about this day." She said he was not worried about the government. He was worried about your mother. I felt the chill run down my spine. "He told you that he did not use her name, but he was clear about the threat model." Marisol said he structured the will to bypass probate as much as possible, but some assets will still have to go through the court process. That means the existence of the will becomes public record, but the specific values can sometimes be kept quieter until the final accounting. However, people talk and people assume. She handed me a card with her personal cell number. "Here is the rule," she said sternly. "You do not discuss dollar amounts with anyone. Not your mother, not Grant, not your siblings. If they ask, you tell them it is in the hands of the lawyers and you do not know yet. If they present you with any document, no matter how innocent it looks, you do not sign it. You bring it to me. Do you understand?" I nodded. "I understand. They will try to make you feel guilty," Marisol warned. "They will tell you that the money belongs to the family unit. They will tell you that your father would have wanted to support everyone. That is a lie. Your father wanted to support you. That is why you are the sole beneficiary of the residual estate." I left her office feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and dread. My father had built a fortress for me, but I was the one who had to defend the gate. The siege began less than 24 hours later. It started with a text message from Denise. It was 7:30 in the evening. I was sitting on my floor surrounded by boxes of my father's books trying to decide what to keep. "Did you find the insurance policy paperwork yet? Grant says some of those companies have a 30-day filing deadline. We need to be on top of this." "No." "How are you holding up?" "No." "Did you eat today?" "Just business." I typed back. "I am handling it with Dad's lawyer. Thanks." 3 minutes later, my phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. Then came a text from Grant. "Kylie, your mom is just worried. Don't shut us out. We are all in this together." Over the next few weeks, the pressure ramped up. It was subtle at first, masked as concern. Denise would invite me to lunch, and halfway through the salad, she would sigh and look out the window. "You know," she would say, wiping a non-existent tear, "I worry so much about Sienna. College is so expensive these days. Evan always said he wanted her to go to a good school. He never said that. I thought he said she should go to a state school and avoid debt. I am just not sure how we are going to manage it with the market being so down. Denise continued, eyeing me. Grant is working so hard, but real estate is tough right now. It would be such a shame if Sienna had to decline her acceptance to Duke because of money, especially when there is so much unused capital sitting around. I took a bite of my salad and said nothing. I had learned the technique Marisol called gray rocking, the as boring and unreacted as a rock. Give them nothing to latch onto. I am sure she will figure it out. I said blandly, financial aid is available. Denise's eyes narrowed. It is not about financial aid, Kylie. It is about family taking care of family. Your father helped raise her. He would not want her to struggle while you're sitting on his retirement fund. The guilt was sharp. It was designed to pierce right through my defenses. I loved Sienna. I did not want her to struggle, but I also knew that Grant had leased a new Range Rover 2 months ago. I knew they had just renovated their kitchen with marble countertops. They had money. They just spent it on appearance instead of substance. I went home that night and opened a new notebook. On the cover, I wrote the log. I started writing down every interaction. October 12th, 1:15 p.m. Lunch with Mom. She implied Dad wanted to pay for Sienna's college. Asked about the value of the estate again. I deflected. October 14th, 6:00 p.m. Voicemail from Grant asking if I want him to recommend a financial advisor. Said, young women often get taken advantage of by banks. October 20th, 9:00 a.m. Text from Mom. Logan needs a car for senior year. Evan promised him he would help. Did you see anything in the will about that? There was nothing in the will about a car for Logan. The probate process dragged on for 4 months. It was a slow, bureaucratic grind of filing inventories, paying final debts, and waiting for the court to stamp documents. During this time, I kept my head down. I went to work. I managed my grief in private. I visited my father's grave and talked to him, telling him about the vultures circling the house. Every time I visited the house in Matthews to clean it out, I felt like I was being watched. Once I found Grant's business card stuck in the front door frame. On the back he had written, "Call me. I have a buyer lined up for this place. Cash offer. Quick close." I tore the card into pieces and threw it in the trash. I was not selling the house. Not yet. Finally, the day came. Marisol called me into her office to sign the final distribution receipts. The probate was closed. The house title was transferring to my name. The accounts were being liquidated and moved into my personal brokerage. It was done legally. Everything was mine. I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I thought naively that maybe now they would back off. Maybe once they realized the money was legally mine, they would stop trying to manipulate me. I walked out of Marisol's office into the bright spring sunshine. I checked my phone. There was a new email notification. It was from Denise. The subject line was in all caps, family meeting. Urgent. I opened it. Finally, now that the legal formalities are out of the way, we need to sit down and discuss the future. We have booked a private room at Copper Ash for Thursday night at 7. It is time to settle things properly and ensure everyone is treated fairly. Grant has arranged for a mediator to be present to help us document the family agreement. Do not be late. Love, Mom. I stared at the screen. A mediator, a family agreement. I called Marisol immediately. She picked up on the first ring. Did you get an email? I asked. No, she said. What does it say? I read it to her. When I got to the part about the mediator, Marisol let out a short, dry laugh. That is not a mediator, Kylie, she said. That is an ambush. What should I do? I asked. Should I not go? Marisol paused. If you do not go, they will come to you. They will come to your apartment. They will come to your job. They will not stop until they hear a hard no. You need to face them. But you are not going alone. I am coming with you. I asked, feeling a wave of relief. No, she said. You are going in alone first. I will be right outside. We need them to show their hand. We need to see exactly what they are asking you to sign before we shut it down. If I walk in with you, they will clam up. I want them to put the gun on the table so we can take a picture of it." I took a deep breath. Thursday night, Copper Ash. "Okay," I said. "I will do it." "Good," Marisol said. "And Kylie, bring your phone and bring your spine. Your father gave you the assets. Now you have to earn the ownership." I hung up and looked at the email again. "Love, Mom." It was the most dishonest sign-off I had ever read. I put the phone in my pocket and started walking toward my car. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was being crowded out by something else, something hotter, something sharper. They wanted a meeting. They wanted to talk about fairness. Fine, I would give them fairness. I would give them exactly what they deserved. The plan was simple, but that did not make it easy. I sat in my car in the parking lot of Copper Ash, watching the valet park a line of luxury sedans. The restaurant was one of those places that charged $30 for a burger because they served it on a slate tile instead of a plate. It was the kind of place Grant loved, all flash, no substance, and loud enough to mask a lack of genuine conversation. My phone buzzed. It was Marisol. "I am parked 2 rows behind you. Black SUV. Give it 10 minutes, then go in. I will come in 5 minutes after you text the signal." I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the recycled air conditioning in my car. I felt like a spy in my own life. Marisol had been clear this was a reconnaissance mission. We needed to know exactly what they were planning before we could dismantle it. If I refused to meet them, they would just keep coming at me with vague threats and guilt trips. But if I went in, sat down, and looked at the paperwork, they would have to show their cards. I needed to see the weapon before I could disarm it. I checked my makeup in the rear view mirror. I looked tired, but I also looked determined. I channeled my father. I imagined him sitting beside me, checking his watch, telling me that emotions were just variables that could be managed. I got out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The hostess station was a sleek podium of backlit onks. The woman standing behind it smiled that practiced hospitality industry smile. "Hallway party?" she asked before I even opened my mouth. "They are waiting for you in the private dining room." Of course they were. She led me through the main dining room, past tables of laughing couples and business dinners. We reached the back of the restaurant, where a heavy frosted glass door separated the elite from the commoners. The hostess opened it, and the ambient noise of the restaurant instantly vanished. The room was soundproof. That was my first thought. It was a killbox. The walls were padded with acoustic fabric, and the lighting was clinical. As I stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind me, sealing me in with the 5 people who claimed to love me. I have already described the scene that greeted me, the lack of menus, the single pen, the stage-like arrangement of my family. But what I did not fully process in that first moment, what only became clear as I sat down and the adrenaline began to settle, was the sheer precision of the trap. This was not a hastily arranged intervention. This was a choreographed extraction. My mother, Denise, was vibrating with nervous energy disguised as maternal warmth. Grant was the heavy, the muscle. Sienna and Logan were the props, the silent moral leverage, and Carter Baines, the man with the laptop, was the technician. I sat down. I looked at the stack of papers. The document on top was titled Family Settlement Agreement. But as I reached for it, I saw Carter tense up. He wanted to control the flow of information. He wanted to narrate the terms before I read the fine print. "Let us walk through this together, Kylie," Carter said, his hand hovering near the paper. "It can be dense legalese. I want to make sure you understand the spirit of the agreement first." I ignored him. I pulled the stack toward me and flipped the cover page. I am a fast reader. It is a necessity in my job. You have to be able to scan lines of code or technical documentation and spot the bug, the anomaly, the thing that does not belong. The first few pages were standard boilerplate about the Family Legacy Trust. It described a pooled investment vehicle. It used buzzwords like generational wealth, asset protection, and tax efficiency. It sounded good. It sounded smart. But then I turned to page 6. My heart hammered against my ribs. Attached to the trust agreement was a second document. It was not about the trust. It was a general durable power of attorney. I read the clauses, my eyes widening. This was not limited to the estate assets. This gave the agents named as Denise and Grant Holloway the power to manage all financial affairs of the principal me. It granted them the authority to access my personal bank accounts, to open and close credit lines in my name, to sell property titled to me, to make medical decisions. I looked up, meeting Grant's gaze. He was watching me closely, his eyes hard and unblinking. "This is a power of attorney," I said, my voice steady despite the nausea rising in my throat. Grant nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "It is a safety measure, Kylie. Just for administration." "Administration?" I asked. "This gives you control over my personal checking account, my salary, my 401k from my job. This has nothing to do with Dad's estate." Denise chimed in, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Kylie, you are overreacting. We just want to help you manage the transition. You are young. You have never handled this kind of money before. If you make a mistake, if you forget a tax filing, you could lose everything. We are just trying to build a safety net for you." "A safety net," I repeated, "by taking control of everything I own." I flipped 2 more pages. There was a beneficiary designation change form. It was pre-filled. It listed the family legacy trust as the primary beneficiary for my father's IRA and life insurance replacing me. But below that, in the section for contingent beneficiaries, it listed Sienna Holloway and Logan Holloway. My name was nowhere on the beneficiary list. I looked at Carter. "Explain this." Carter smiled, a tight-paint expression. "It is a pass-through entity. MS. Barnes, the trust holds the assets. You are a beneficiary of the trust. This form just ensures that the assets flow correctly into the pot." "Where is the trust instrument?" I asked. "The document that defines who gets money out of the trust." Carter tapped his laptop. "We are still finalizing the distribution schedules, but rest assured it is entirely equitable." "So, you want me to sign over 100% of my inheritance, plus give you power of attorney over my entire financial life into a trust where the rules for getting money out have not even been written yet." Grant slammed his hand on the table. The sound was dull and heavy in the soundproof room. "You are being selfish," he barked. "This is about the family. Your father's money should benefit everyone. Do you think he wanted you to hoard it while your sister takes out student loans? Do you think he wanted you to live like a princess while we struggled to keep the family home?" "Struggle?" I asked. "You just bought a boat." "Grant, I saw it on Facebook." Grant's face turned a violent shade of red. "That is an investment. It is for client entertainment. You do not understand how business works." I looked at Sienna. She was shrinking into her chair, looking like she wanted to disappear. Logan was staring at the wall, his jaw clenched. They knew deep down they knew this was wrong, that they had been coached. They had been told that I was the villain, the greedy sister keeping their future hostage. I looked back at the papers. There was one more document at the bottom, a confession of judgment. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. A confession of judgment is a legal nuclear weapon. It essentially says that if I violate the terms of the agreement, I automatically admit guilt and liability, bypassing a trial. It would allow them to garnish my wages or seize my assets without me even being able to defend myself in court. This was not a settlement. This was an enslavement. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why do I have to sign this today?" "By the rush." Carter leaned forward. His nice guy mask was starting to slip. He looked at his watch. "Because MS. Barnes, the probate window is closing. If we do not file this agreement by Monday, the court will lock the distribution based on the original will. And if that happens, your mother and Grant will have no choice but to file a contest." "A contest?" I said. "On what grounds?" "Undue influence," Carter said smoothly. "Mental incapacity. We have witnesses prepared to testify that your father was not in his right mind when he signed that last will. We have emails where he sounds confused." "That is a lie," I said. "It does not matter if it is a lie," Carter said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "It matters that it is a lawsuit. Do you know how long a contested estate takes to settle in Mecklenburg County? 18 months minimum. And during that time, every dime is frozen. You will not see a penny and the legal fees. They will come out of the estate. By the time we are done, the lawyers will have half of it." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air like smoke. "And it is public record," he added, "civil litigation involving fraud accusations. At Styx, your employer in the tech sector. They do background checks, do they not? How would it look if you were named as a defendant in a case involving elder abuse and coercion?" I stared at him. This was the leverage. They were banking on my fear. They thought that because I was a rule follower, because I had a clean record, I would be terrified of a stain. They were weaponizing my own integrity against me. My mother reached out and touched my hand. Her skin was cold. "Just sign it, Kylie," she whispered. "Please, let us just be a family again. Do not make this ugly." I looked at her hand on mine. It was the hand that had brushed my hair when I was little. It was also the hand that had signed the credit card receipts that put my father in debt. I looked at the pen, the Mont Blanc. It was heavy, black, and shiny. It looked like a weapon. I realized then that they did not just want the money. If it was just about the money, they would have asked for a loan. They would have begged. No, this was about control. They could not stand that Evan had given me the power to say no to them. They could not stand that I was independent. They wanted to break me. They wanted to put me back in the box where I was just a cameo child, the one who existed to serve their narrative. If I signed these papers, I would never be free. I would be tethered to Grant's bad investments and Denise's emotional neediness for the rest of my life. I felt a strange calm wash over me. It was the calm of a person who realizes the bomb has already been armed and the only choice left is to detonate it on their own terms. I pulled my hand away from my mother's grip. I looked around the table, really seeing them for the first time, not as my family, but as a syndicate. 1, I counted softly, Grant the bully. 2, Denise the manipulator. 3, Sienna, the collateral damage. 4, Logan, the silent accomplice. 5, Carter the mercenary. I smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. "You really thought this through, didn't you?" I said. "The soundproof room, the lack of witnesses, the threat to my job." "We are just protecting our interests." Brad grunted. "No, I said you are trying to mug me. But you made one mistake." "What is that?" Carter asked, his eyes narrowing. "You sued. I came here alone." I picked up my phone. I saw the draft message I had prepared in the car. It was just one word, but it held the weight of an entire legal team. Now I pressed send. I watched the progress bar zip across the screen. Delivered. I set the phone down and folded my hands on top of the power of attorney form. "I suggest you get comfortable," I said to Carter, "because the actual meeting is about to start." The knock on the door was not loud, but it was precise. It was 2 sharp raps, followed by a pause, and then a third. It was the sound of authority arriving before anyone at the table could react. The handle turned. The heavy soundproof door swept open, admitting a slice of the ambient restaurant noise from the hallway before clicking shut again, sealing us back in. But the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The oxygen, which had felt so thin a moment ago, suddenly rushed back in. Marisol Veiger stepped into the room. She looked like she had just walked out of a courtroom where she had won a $10 million verdict. She was wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit her impeccably, and she carried a slim leather portfolio in one hand. Her expression was pleasant, almost conversational, but her eyes were scanning the room with the efficiency of a targeting computer. "I am sorry to interrupt dinner," she said, her voice calm and level, "but I believe my client is currently being asked to review legal documents without her counsel present." Grant stood up halfway, his napkin falling to the floor. "Who are you?" he demanded. Marisol ignored him. She walked around the table and stood directly behind my chair. I felt her presence like a shield wall. She placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, a silent signal that the cavalry had arrived, and then she looked across the table at Carter Baines. Carter had gone pale. He had closed his laptop, but his hands were still resting on the lid, twitching slightly. "I am Mara Veiger," she said to Carter. "I represent the estate of Evan Barnes, and I represent MS. Barnes in her personal capacity regarding all probate matters, and you are—" Carter cleared his throat. It was a wet, nervous sound. I am Carter Baines. I am advising the family on estate planning and asset protection. Advising the family, Marisol repeated, tasting the words as if they were spoiled milk. She tilted her head slightly. That is interesting, Mr. Baines, because I was under the impression that the estate was already settled. In fact, I have the final distribution order from the Clerk of Superior Court in my briefcase. It was stamped 3 days ago. She looked at the stack of papers in front of me. Are you a probate attorney, Mr. Baines? She asked. I do general practice, Carter said, his voice finding a little bit of its slick rhythm again. I specialize in trust formation. We are just trying to facilitate a more equitable arrangement for the beneficiaries. Marisol smiled. It was a shark smile. General practice. I see. And which firm are you with? I do not believe I have seen your name on the Mecklenburg County bar roster for probate litigation. I am independent, Carter said quickly. I have a solo practice, and your office is located where there was a silence. A long, excruciating silence. Carter shifted in his seat. I work out of a shared executive suite in Valentine, he muttered. Marisol nodded slowly. I see. And does your malpractice insurance cover drafting a confession of judgment against a beneficiary in a private dining room with no independent review? Because that is a very specific kind of liability, Mr. Baines. In fact, most carriers would consider that a fast track to disbarment. Grant slammed his hand on the table again. Now listen here. We are not in court. This is a family meeting. We are trying to help Kylie avoid a mess. You have no right to barge in here and threaten us. Marisol turned her gaze to Grant. It was like watching a laser pointer shift from a wall to a forehead. Mr. Holloway, she said, her voice dropping a few dec but gaining in intensity. I have every right, because what you are doing here, cornering a young woman in a soundproof room, misrepresenting the status of a closed probate case and pressuring her to sign away her assets under threat of litigation is not a family meeting. It is coercion. It is duress. And if I were to call the police right now and show them that power of attorney document, they might even call it attempted extortion. Denise let out a gasp. She pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes wide and wet. Extortion, she cried. How dare you? I am her mother. I gave birth to her. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face with impressive speed. Kylie, tell her to stop. Tell her to leave. We just want us to be together. I just want unity. I want us to be a team again. Why do you have to bring lawyers into this? Why do you have to be so cold? I looked at my mother. 5 minutes ago, she was telling me to sign or face a lawsuit. Now she was the martyr. I am not the one who brought a lawyer. Mom, I said quietly. I pointed at Carter. You brought him. You brought the papers. You brought the threats. Marisol reached over my shoulder and picked up the power of attorney document. She did not ask for permission. She just took it. She flipped through it, her eyes scanning the text rapidly. She stopped on the last page. Her eyebrows shot up. Oh, this is rich, she said softly. She turned the document around and placed it on the table so I could see it. She pointed to the bottom of the page to the notary block. Usually, a notary block is blank. You sign it in front of the notary. They stamp it and they sign it. It is the witness to the act. But this block was not blank. The notary's signature was already there. It was signed in blue ink, and there was a stamp pressed into the paper. Who is Brenda Miller? Marisol asked. I stared at the name. It took me a second, but then I recognized it. Brenda is Mom's tennis partner, I said. Marisol looked at Denise. So, you had your friend notarize a signature that had not happened yet. You had her attest that Kylie Barnes appeared before her and signed this document freely and voluntarily when Kylie Barnes was not even in the room. That is a felony, Marisol said, her voice slicing through the air. That is notary fraud. And since this document was presented by you, Mr. Baines, you are complicit in it. Carter stood up. He grabbed his laptop. I think we are done here, he said. His voice was shaking. I was told this was a pre-agreed arrangement. I was told the notary had already met with the client. I am not part of this. He looked at Grant. Do not call me again. Carter Baines walked out of the room. He did not look back. He left the paperwork on the table. The silence that followed his exit was heavy and suffocating. Grant was staring at Marisol with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. His face was a mask of fury. The veins in his neck were bulging against his collar. For a second, I thought he was going to lunge across the table. I saw his hand twitch into a fist, but then he took a breath. I watched him physically wrestle the rage back down. He smoothed his tie. He unclenched his jaw. He put the mask back on. "Well," he said, his voice tight but controlled, "it seems there has been a misunderstanding. We were just trying to expedite things." Brenda must have misunderstood the instructions. Marisol closed the folder she was holding. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Holloway. There is only a ceased and desisted attempt at fraud." She looked at me. "Kylie, stand up. We are leading." I pushed my chair back. My legs felt weak, like I had just run a marathon. But I stood up. I grabbed my purse. I grabbed my phone. I looked at Sienna and Logan. They were both staring at the table, their faces pale. They looked terrified. Not of me, but of the explosion they knew was coming later. When there were no witnesses, "I am sorry," I whispered to them. Marisol stepped between me and the table. "From this point forward," she said to Denise and Grant, "any communication regarding the estate, the trust, or any financial matter will go through my office. If you text Kylie, I will file a harassment suit. If you show up at her house, I will file for a restraining order. If you try to access any of her accounts using the fraudulent power of attorney, I will have the district attorney on the phone before the transaction clears. Do I make myself clear?" Denise did not answer. She was staring at the tablecloth, picking at a stain that was not there. Grant nodded once stiffly. Crystal Marisol put a hand on my back. "Let us go." I walked toward the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I felt lightheaded. I had done it. I had faced them. I had counted to 5 and I had won. But as I reached the door, my mother spoke. Her voice was soft. It was not the screech of a harpy or the wail of a victim. It was something worse. It was the quiet, disappointed tone she used to use when I came home with a B on my report card. "You are making a mistake, Kylie," she said. I paused, my hand on the door handle. "You think you won," she whispered, "but you have no idea what it takes to keep a family together. You are just like your father. You think everything is a transaction." I turned my head slightly. "I am nothing like you," I said, "and that is the only inheritance I care about." "You are making this very hard for yourself," she said. Her voice was almost affectionate, which made the threat land with a sickening thud. "We just wanted to protect you now." "Well, now you are on your own." I opened the door and walked out. The hallway was cool and dim. The air smelled of roasted garlic and wine, but to me it smelled like freedom. I walked fast. I did not run, but I wanted to. Marisol was right beside me, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the floor. We did not speak until we were outside, standing under the awning of the valet stand. The night air was humid and thick, typical for Charlotte, but I gulped it down like it was pure oxygen. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, not a little shake, but a violent tremor. The adrenaline was crashing. Marisol looked at me. She did not smile. She looked serious. "You did good," she said, "but listen to me, Kylie. That was not a surrender back there. That was a regroup." I nodded. "I know." Grant looked. "Dangerous," she said. "And her mother?" That notary stamp was not an accident. That was premeditation. They are desperate. People who are desperate and accustomed to a certain life still do not just walk away from 6 figures because a lawyer yelled at them. "What do we do?" I asked. Marisol handed the valet ticket to the attendant. "We lock everything down." She said, "Tonight you change every password you have. You put a freeze on your credit. You watch your back. Because they tried to do this the easy way, the family meeting way. Now they are going to try the hard way." She looked me in the eye. "They just lost the element of surprise," she said. "But they still know your date of birth, your social security number, and your mother's maiden name in the modern world. That is more dangerous than a gun." The valet pulled my car up. I got in as I drove away, checking my rear view mirror. I expected to see them running after me, but the entrance to Copper Ash was empty. They were not running. They were planning. My mother's last words echoed in the quiet of my car. You are making this very hard for yourself." It sounded less like a prediction and more like a promise. For 72 hours, there was nothing. No phone calls, no screaming voicemails, no cars idling slowly past my apartment complex. The silence was absolute, but it was not peaceful. It felt like the heavy static-filled air before a tornado touches down. I went to work. I logged into my meetings and I wrote code. But a part of my brain was constantly scanning the horizon, waiting for the impact. On the third morning, the first tremor hit. I was making coffee when my phone chimed. It was a text from Denise. There was no greeting, no emotional appeal this time. It was just a cold, detached observation. "It is a shame you are choosing to be difficult. The paperwork is going to get very messy if you keep this up. We just want to make sure nothing gets lost in the confusion." I stared at the screen. Confusion. These were not random words. They were a forecast. My mother was not telling me how she felt. She was telling me what was about to happen. I put the coffee down. I did not reply. Instead, I walked into my home office, sat down at my dual monitor setup, and went to war. I work in tech. I understand how systems talk to each other. I understand that convenience is usually the enemy of security. And I knew that for 29 years, my life had been intertwined with the people who were now my adversaries. They knew my birthday. They knew my social security number. They knew the name of my first pet, the street I grew up on, and my mother's maiden name, the holy trinity of security questions. I started with the banks. I logged into my primary checking account. The password was something simple I had used for 5 years. I changed it to a randomized string of 20 characters that looked like someone had smashed their face against the keyboard. Then I went to the security questions. "What is your mother's maiden name?" The system expected me to type Miller. If I typed Miller, Denise or Grant could reset my password in 30 seconds. I deleted it. I typed Blue Submarine 42. "What was the name of your first pet?" I typed Pizza Topping Pineapple. I lied to every single security question across 11 different accounts. I created a mental air gap between my reality and the data my family possessed. If they tried to answer based on their knowledge of Kylie Barnes, the daughter, they would fail. They needed to know Kylie Barnes, the stranger. Next, I initiated a credit freeze with all 3 bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I locked my credit report so tight that even I would have trouble buying a toaster on an installment plan. Finally, I set up transaction alerts. Any movement of money over 1 cent would trigger an email and a text to my phone. I sat back, my heart rate finally slowing down. I thought I was ahead of them. I was wrong. At 2:30 that afternoon, I received an email. The subject line was urgent, unauthorized access detected. Action required. The sender appeared to be my bank. The logo was the correct shade of red and gold. The font was standard corporate sans serif. The body of the email stated that there had been a suspicious login attempt from an IP address in Atlanta, and for my protection, my account had been temporarily restricted. To restore access, I needed to click the link below and verify my identity. My finger hovered over the mouse. It was a visceral reaction. Fear makes you want to fix things immediately. The brain sees action required and wants to comply to make the anxiety go away. But then I paused. I hovered the cursor over the sender's address without clicking. The display name said Bank Security Team, but the actual email address was Support Wells Fargo Security Alert. My bank's domain was Wells Fargo. It was a phishing attack, and it was a good one. It was not the sloppy type-ridden spam you get from a prince in a foreign country. This was targeted. This was spear phishing. They knew which bank I used. They knew my email address, and they had registered a lookalike domain that was just 1 hyphen away from being legitimate. I did not click the link. I took a screenshot of the email capturing the header in the timestamp. Then I picked up my phone and called the number on the back of my actual debit card. I navigated through the automated menu, my foot tapping a nervous rhythm against the floor when a human representative finally answered. I skipped the pleasantries. "I need to know if there have been any failed login attempts on my account today," I said. The representative asked for my verbal password, which I had just changed, and put me on hold. When she came back, her voice was serious. MS. Barnes, we show 3 failed attempts to access your online banking in the last hour. Where did they come from? I asked. The IP address traces back to a residential provider in Charlotte, she said. The device signature is recognized as a MacBook Pro. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I use a PC. Grant uses a MacBook Pro. They were not just trying to scare me. They were trying to break in. If I had not changed my password that morning, if I'd have left it as the name of my high school mascot plus my graduation year, they would be inside right now. They would be draining my funds, transferring the inheritance into that family trust before I could stop them. I hung up and called Marisol. I told her everything, the text, the phishing email, the failed login. This is not a civil dispute anymore, Marisol said, her voice hard. This is attempted identity theft. It is a federal crime. They are trying to brute force my life. I said they are looking for a weak point, she replied. And if they cannot find one digitally, they will try to create one administratively. Kylie, have you checked your physical mail status? I frowned. My physical mail? Aye, because that is the oldest trick in the book. She said, if they cannot hack your email, they will try to intercept your paper statements. They will try to get the new credit cards or the reset codes sent to a place they control. I hung up and immediately logged into the United States Postal Service website. I tried to verify my current registration. The site gave me an error message. A pending change of address request is already on file for this individual. My blood ran cold. I navigated to the details. The request had been submitted online 24 hours ago. It requested that all mail for Kylie Barnes be forwarded from my apartment address to a P.O. box in Matthews, North Carolina, Matthews, where my mother lived. They were trying to reroute my life. They wanted to steal my bank statements, my legal notices from Marisol, my new credit cards, everything. They wanted to blind me. If the bank sent a letter saying, "Did you authorize this transfer?" it would go to the P box. Rat would open it, shred it, and I would be none the wiser until the money was gone. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of pure crystallized rage. This was not family. Family does not fish you. Family does not commit mail fraud against you. This was a coordinated attack by people who viewed me as a resource to be harvested. I did not scream. I did not cry. I went into evidence collection mode. I printed the USPS notification. I saved the email headers from the phishing attempt as a PDF. I downloaded the call log from my phone showing the time I spoke to the bank. Then I went to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center website, ike3.gov. I filed a formal report. I detailed the unauthorized access attempts. I detailed the phishing email. I listed the suspects Denise Holloway and Grant Holloway. Next, I filed a fraud affidavit with my bank, flagging the account for HILE monitoring. I told them explicitly, I am under attack by family members with access to my personal history. Verbal passwords must be mandatory. But I knew digital walls were not enough. If they were bold enough to reroute my mail, they were bold enough to come to my door. I drove to the electronics store. I did not want to wait for shipping. I bought a video doorbell with high recording and night vision. Then I bought a second camera, a small battery-operated outdoor unit with a motion sensor. I drove back to my apartment complex. It was a garden-style setup with my door facing a breezeway and the mailboxes clustered at the end of the parking lot. I installed the doorbell camera first. It stared out at the walkway, an unblinking electric eye. Then I waited until dusk. I took the second camera and a small ladder. I walked down to the mailbox cluster. I found a tree that had a direct line of sight to my specific box, box 402. I mounted the camera high up, hidden amidst the branches, angled perfectly to capture the face of anyone who opened that metal door. I synced both cameras to my phone. The feeds were clear. I could see the grain of the concrete on the walkway. I could see the rust on the mailbox hinge. I went back inside and locked the deadbolt. I sat on my couch, my phone in my hand, watching the live feeds. My apartment felt different now. It was no longer just a home. It was a fortress, and I was the watchman. I looked at the stack of evidence I had printed out, the screenshots, the logs, the fraud reports. Grant and Denise were used to playing games with emotions. They were used to guilt trips, gaslighting, and social pressure. They thought they could bully me because they remembered the 9-year-old girl who just wanted her parents to stop fighting. But they forgot what I did for a living. They forgot that I spent my days looking for bugs in the code, tracing errors back to their source and patching vulnerabilities. They were playing with data. They were sloppy. They left fingerprints. They used a notary who was a tennis partner. They used a domain that was one letter off. They used their own hometown for the P.O. box. I looked at the screen, watching the empty breezeway. I play with evidence. I whispered to the empty room, and I was going to collect every single pixel of it. It was a Tuesday, and on the surface, I was just another remote worker sitting through a quarterly budget review on Zoom. On my main monitor, a product manager named Steve was droning on about bandwidth and synergy. I was nodding at the webcam every 30 seconds to show I was engaged, but my mind was elsewhere. It was 12:45 in the afternoon. The sun was high and bright outside, casting hard shadows across the parking lot of my apartment complex. Then my phone buzzed against the desk surface. It was a sharp double vibration. I glanced down. A notification from my security app lit up the screen. Person detected. Mailbox camera. I felt a spike of adrenaline that had nothing to do with corporate budgets. I slid my mouse over to my second monitor, keeping my face neutral for the Zoom meeting, and opened the live feed. The video buffered for a split second before snapping into crisp Haitian focus. The camera I had hidden in the tree was working perfectly. Standing in front of the cluster of metal mailboxes was my mother. Denise was wearing a tracksuit and oversized sunglasses, the kind celebrities wear when they want to be seen hiding. She looked out of place. She was not walking for exercise. Her body language was tight, anxious. She was holding her phone to her ear with one hand, and with the other, she was reaching out to touch the cold metal of box 402. My box. I muted my microphone on the Zoom call. I have a bio-emergency. Be right back. I typed into the chat, and then I killed the camera feed. I gave my full attention to the surveillance. Denise was looking around nervously. She scanned the parking lot. She checked the breezeway. She looked right at the tree where the camera was hidden, but she did not see the lens. She was too busy acting guilty. I switched views on the app to the doorbell camera to see if I could get a wider angle of the parking lot. That was when I saw him. Parked about 50 ft away in a spot reserved for visitors was Grant's black SUV. The engine was running. I could see the faint exhaust vibration. The windows were tinted, but the angle of the sun was hitting the windshield just right. Grant was in the driver's seat. He was not looking at the road. He was looking down at his lap. I zoomed in digitally on the phone screen. There was a bluish glow illuminating his face from below. He had a laptop open. My heart started hammering against my ribs. This was not a social call. This was a heist. Suddenly, another notification dropped down from the top of my phone screen. It was my banking app. Security alert. New device attempting to sign in. Is this your? The pieces clicked together in my head with terrifying clarity. It was a coordinated two-pronged attack. Grant was in the car trying to brute force or reset the password to my accounts. The bank's security protocols were likely asking for a secondary verification, something physical, something tied to my address or a mailed code. They had timed it. They triggered the request, and Denise was standing at the mailbox, waiting to intercept the physical letter or code the moment the mail carrier dropped it off, or perhaps looking for a statement I had not yet collected that contained account numbers. I did not panic. I did not run outside screaming. I did what a data analyst does. I hit screen record. I captured the entire frame. The timestamp at the top read 12:48 p.m. I switched back and forth between the camera app, showing Denise at the mailbox, and the banking app, showing the active intrusion attempt on the video feed. Denise was getting agitated. I could see her lips moving. She was talking to Grant. "It is not opening," she seemed to say, or something close to it. She jiggled the handle of my mailbox. I had changed the lock 3 days ago. A simple $10 fix from the hardware store that she evidently had not anticipated. She pulled harder. She looked down at her phone, then back at the car. She was frantic now. She knew they were exposed. She knew that every second they spent in that parking lot increased the risk. Grant must have said something sharp in her ear, because she flinched. She let go of the mailbox door and took a step back. She looked at the car and shook her head. On my phone, the banking app updated access denied. Too many failed attempts. Grant slammed the steering wheel. I saw it clearly on the wide-angle lens. He threw his hands up, said something that looked like a curse, and closed the laptop. Denise skewered toward the car, looking over her shoulder one last time. She got into the passenger seat. The SUV reversed aggressively out of the spot, tires screeching slightly on the asphalt, and sped away toward the exit. I stopped the recording. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the validation. I was not crazy. I was not paranoid. My mother and her husband were literally driving a getaway car in my parking lot after a failed digital break-in. I sat there for a moment in the silence of my apartment. I replayed the video. 12:48 p.m. Denise touches the mailbox. 12:48 p.m. Bank alert triggers. 12:49 p.m. Grant slams the steering wheel. 12:50 p.m. They flee. I downloaded the IP logs from my bank security portal immediately. I wanted the metadata. Sure enough, the access attempt came from a mobile hotspot. The carrier was the same one Grant used for his business phone. I called Marisol. I got them, I said. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I have them on video. What happened? Marisol asked. They tried a synchronized breach. I explained. Grant on the laptop, Denise at the mailbox. They were trying to bypass the two-factor authentication. I have the video of her trying to pry the box open while the bank alert was live on my screen. There was a long silence on the other end. When Marisol spoke, her tone was no longer that of a family attorney. It was the tone of a prosecutor. That is conspiracy, she said. That is not a civil dispute anymore, Kylie. That is criminal intent. We have pattern and coordination. What do I do? You go to the police station, she said. Right now, you file a report for attempted identity theft, mail tampering, and harassment. You show them that video. We need a paper trail that is stamped by law enforcement. And then we file for a temporary restraining order. Marisol said, this proves immediate danger. They know where you live, and they are actively trying to rob you. No judge in Mecklenburg County will deny this. Okay, I said, I am going. Wait, Marisol added. Kylie, is Grant a licensed realtor? Yes, I said. He has a broker's license. Good, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Because real estate boards take a very dim view of fraud and financial misconduct. Once we have the police report, we are going to send a certified letter to the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. We are going to file an ethics complaint. I felt a cold thrill. Grant prided himself on his image. He loved being the successful businessman in the suit. His license was his ego. Do it, I said. I hung up and grabbed my keys. I drove to the police station with the evidence on a USB drive in my pocket. Sitting in the waiting room of the precinct, surrounded by people reporting stolen bikes and fender benders, I had a realization that hit me harder than the sight of Denise at my mailbox. For weeks, I had thought this was about greed. I thought they just wanted the money to pay for their lifestyle, for the boat, for the image. But as I watched the video one more time on my phone, watching my mother take orders from Grant, watching her desperately try to break into my private life, I realized I was wrong. It was not about the money. The money was just a tool. It was about control. They could not stand that I had escaped. They could not stand that the cameo child, the extra in their movie, had rewritten the script. They needed to access my accounts not just to take the cash, but to render me dependent again. If they drained my funds, I would have to come back. I would have to ask for help. I would have to sign their family trust just to survive. They wanted to break my knees so they could offer me a crutch. I walked up to the desk sergeant. Can I help you? He asked, looking bored. Yes, I said, placing the USB drive on the counter. I need to report a crime in progress. The suspects are my parents. The sergeant looked up, his eyebrows raising, and I added, my voice steady, I have it all on tape. I walked out of that station an hour later with a case number in my hand. It was a small slip of paper, but it felt heavier than the stack of documents they had tried to make me sign in the restaurant. I sat in my car and looked at the case number 2025-498. It was the combination to a lock that was about to shut them out of my life forever. I texted Marisol. Police report filed. Case number secure, she replied instantly. Drafting the complaint to the licensing board now. Grant is about to have a very bad week. I put the car in gear. I was not going home to hide. I was going to buy a better lock. The legal counterattack arrived on a Monday morning, delivered not by a family member, but by a courier carrying a thick envelope on bonded linen paper. Denise and Grant had hired a man named Richard Sterling. I knew the name. He was a shark who specialized in high-asset divorces and reputation management for the Charlotte elite. He was expensive, aggressive, and known for burying the truth under a landslide of motions. Sterling's letter was a masterpiece of gaslighting. It did not apologize. It did not admit fault. Instead, it painted a picture of a grieving, confused daughter, me, who was suffering from acute emotional distress following the tragic loss of her father. The letter claimed that my parents' actions at the mailbox were simply a welfare check because I had stopped responding to calls. The attempt to access my bank account, a clerical error caused by an old shared computer system, the power of attorney with the fraudulent notary stamp, a draft document that was never intended to be executed without my presence. They were rewriting reality. They were trying to turn my defensive measures into symptoms of paranoia. Sterling even hinted that if I persisted with the police report, they would file a defamation suit that would bankrupt me. I sat in Marisol's office reading the letter, my hands shaking with rage. "They are calling me crazy," I said, tossing the letter onto her desk. "They are saying I imagined the whole thing." Marisol did not look perturbed. She picked up the letter, scanned it, and dropped it into a file labeled Defense Posturing. "Of course they are," Marisol said calmly. "This is the standard playbook. Kindly deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. They cannot argue the facts. So they are attacking your credibility. They want you to feel small. They want you to think that no one will believe you over the respectable Denise and Grant Holloway." She stood up and walked to the whiteboard on her wall. It was covered in a timeline drawn in black marker. "But here is the problem for Mr. Sterling," Marisol continued, uncapping a red marker. "Narratives are soft, evidence is hard." She circled the date of the phishing email. "We have the email headers," she said, "one character off from the official bank domain. That is not a clerical error. That is purchase with intent." She circled the date of the USP's change of address. "We have the digital receipt. IP address confirmed to Grant's mobile hotspot. You do not accidentally rewrote someone's mail to a P.O. box in another city." She circled the notary fraud. "And this," she tapped the board hard, "this is the nail in the coffin. A notary stamp on a document you never saw, signed by a woman who plays tennis with your mother. That is not a draft. That is a forgery." She turned to me. "Let them write their fairy tales. We are writing a police procedural." The investigation moved into the discovery phase. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Detective Miller, no relation to the fraudulent notary, requested access to my digital life. She needed to verify that I had not, in fact, given them permission. It was invasive. I had to hand over my laptop and my phone to a forensic tech unit for 24 hours. I had to provide them with my search history, my location data, and my text logs. It felt like being stripped naked in a room full of strangers. I had to surrender my privacy to prove I had been violated. But I did it. I unlocked everything. I gave them the passwords. I wanted there to be zero shadows where Denise could hide. While my devices were in custody, I used an old backup tablet to stay connected. It was slow and clunky, but it worked. On the second night, a notification popped up on Instagram. It was a message request from a user named BlueSky99. The account had 0 followers, 0 posts, and no profile picture. I almost deleted it, thinking it was a bot or another phishing attempt, but the preview text stopped me cold. "Don't block me." I heard them talking about the code in the letter. My stomach dropped. I opened the message. "Who is this?" I typed. The 3 dots of the typing indicator bobbed for a long time. Then it's S. I am using a burner account on an old iPod. They took my phone to check if I was talking to you. Sienna, my 19-year-old stepsister. I felt a rush of fear for her. If Grant caught her talking to me, the backlash would be severe. Grant controlled the Wi-Fi, the cars, the tuition. Sienna was living in the belly of the beast. Are you safe? I asked. I'm okay, she replied. But the house is crazy. Mom is crying all the time, saying you are trying to send her to jail. Grant is on the phone with lawyers constantly. He is selling the boat. He says it is for liquidity. I stared at the screen. Selling the boat. That meant the legal retainers were bleeding them dry. Sienna, you do not have to tell me anything. I wrote. I do not want you to get in trouble. I have to. She wrote back. I heard them, Kylie, the night before the mailbox thing. They were in the kitchen. Grant was yelling at Carter on speakerphone. He was asking if the test login worked. He said they needed to trigger a paper letter so they could grab the code. My breath caught in my throat. This was the smoking gun, a witness to the conspiracy. Did you hear anything else? I asked, my fingers trembling on the glass screen. Yeah, Sienna wrote. And this is the weird part. Grant called Carter an idiot. He said, I should have never trusted a disbarred personal injury guy to handle a trust. I froze. Disbarred. I typed. Carter Baines is disbarred, I think. So, Sienna replied. Grant said he was doing him a favor by letting him handle this because Carter needed money. Kylie, I do not think Carter is a real lawyer anymore. This changed everything. I took screenshots of the conversation, then told Sienna to delete the account and wipe the device. Be careful. I told her, I love you. I love you too. She wrote, please do not let them ruin my life too. The next morning, I was at Marisol's office the moment she unlocked the door. I showed her the screenshots. Marisol's eyes widened. She did not say a word. She swiveled her chair to her computer and opened the North Carolina State Bar directory. She typed in Carter Baines. No results found. She navigated to the disciplinary archive. She typed the name again. There it was. Carter Baines had surrendered his license 4 years ago following an investigation into the mishandling of client settlement funds in a personal injury case. He was not a lawyer. He was a civilian playing dress-up. Oh, Grant, Marisol whispered, a look of pure predatory delight crossing her face. You arrogant fool. She looked at me. Do you understand what this means, Kylie? Practicing law without a license is a Class 1 misdemeanor in North Carolina, but aiding and abetting it, soliciting it, and using a non-lawyer to draft legal documents to defraud a beneficiary. She picked up her phone. We are not just looking at fraud anymore. We are looking at a criminal enterprise. 2 days later, the dynamic shifted. The aggressive posturing from Richard Sterling vanished. The threats of defamation suits evaporated. Instead, Marisol received a phone call from him requesting a without prejudice settlement conference. They wanted to deal. They knew we had the disciplinary record. They knew about the notary. They likely suspected we had more evidence than we were showing. The walls were closing in and Grant was trying to buy an exit. Marisol relayed the offer to me in her conference room. Here is the proposal, she said, reading from her notes. Grant and Denise agree to drop all claims to the estate. They agree to sign a permanent cease and desist regarding your finances. They will pay 50% of your legal fees. And in exchange, I asked. In exchange, Marisol said, looking me in the eye, you withdraw the police report, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and the complaint to the Real Estate Commission goes away. It was the peace offer. It was the easy way out. I could sign a piece of paper and the harassment would stop. I would get my money. I would get my life back. My mother wouldn't go to jail. Grant wouldn't lose his license. We could all go back to being strangers who sent Christmas cards. I looked out the window at the Charlotte skyline. I thought about the 9-year-old girl sitting on the stairs listening to them fight about money. I thought about my father eating frozen lasagna, warning me about this exact moment. If I took the deal, they would learn nothing. They would just learn that they needed to be more careful next time. They would refine their methods. And eventually they would do this to Sienna or Logan or someone else. They tried to steal my identity, I said quietly. They tried to break into my house. They forged signatures. Yes, Marisol said. If I sign this, I said, I am telling them that the price of betraying me is just legal fees. I am telling them that crime pays as long as you have a checkbook. I turned back to Marisol. No deal, I said. Marisol nodded, looking proud. Are you sure it is going to get ugly? If we refuse, the prosecutor takes over. You will have to testify. You will have to see your mother in a courtroom, not at a dinner table. She stopped being my mother the moment she tried to pry open my mailbox, I said. Now she is just a defendant. Okay, Marisol said. I will tell Sterling. The rejection of the settlement offer hit them like a bomb. The district attorney's office, bolstered by the video evidence and the revelation about Carter Baines, decided to move forward. They were filing charges: conspiracy to commit identity theft, forgery, practicing law without a license for Carter. The date for the preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Those 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. I met with the assistant district attorney, a sharp young man who treated the case with the seriousness of a bank robbery. I went over my testimony again and again. I learned how to answer questions without volunteering information. I learned how to look at the jury, not the defense table. But the hardest part was the silence. My phone stopped ringing. The text stopped. But the silence was different now. It was not the silence of waiting. It was the silence of severance. I was cutting the cord, not just the financial cord, but the emotional one. I had to mourn the loss of my family while they were still alive. I had to accept that the woman who had given birth to me had chosen a lifestyle over her daughter. One evening, a few days before the hearing, I was organizing my files. I found an old photo of us, me, Denise, and Dad before the divorce. We were at the beach. I was 5. Denise was smiling, looking young and carefree. I looked at the photo for a long time. I tried to find a trace of the woman who would try to rob me in that smiling face. I realized she was never really there. The woman in the photo was playing a role, just like she played the role of the grieving widow, just like she played the role of the victim. I put the photo in the shredder, the machine word, slicing the memory into thin, unrovable strips. I was not Kylie the daughter anymore. I was the witness for the prosecution, and I was ready to take the stand. The Mecklenburg County Courthouse does not look like the places you see on legal dramas. There is no mahogany paneling that gleams under warm lighting, and the gallery is not filled with suspenseful whispers. It is a building of beige linoleum, scuffed chairs, and the pervasive smell of floor wax and stale anxiety. It is a place where lives are reduced to file numbers and timestamps. I arrived 30 minutes early. Marisol was already there, looking like a gladiator in a pinstriped suit. She checked my appearance. A navy blazer, white blouse, simple trousers. I looked boring. I looked reliable. I looked like a tax audit in hue and form. Remember, Marisol told me as we stood near the metal detectors, you are not a daughter today. You are a witness. You do not offer opinions. You offer facts. If they ask you how you feel, you bring it back to what you saw. I nodded. I had spent the last 3 nights practicing my breathing. I had turned my heart into a hard drive. When we walked into the courtroom, they were already seated at the defense table. Denise had dressed for the role of a lifetime. She was wearing a soft pastel blue cardigan over a modest dress, the kind of outfit a kindergarten teacher or a beloved grandmother would wear. She had skipped the heavy makeup. Her hair was pulled back loosely. She looked small, fragile, and utterly harmless. She looked like a woman who baked cookies, not a woman who hired a disbarred lawyer to steal her daughter's inheritance. Grant sat next to her. He was trying for dignified, but he landed on rigid. His hands were clasped so tightly on the table that his knuckles were white. He did not look at me. He stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench, his jaw working rhythmically, grinding his teeth. Their lawyer, Richard Sterling, was arranging his papers with a relaxed, confident air. He smiled at the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Konsinke, as if this were all a misunderstanding that could be cleared up over a round of golf. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge, a woman with a face carved out of granite, took the bench. State versus Holloway, she read. The opening statements were a study in contrast. Mr. Konsinke was brief. He promised to show a pattern of calculated financial predation. He used words like identity theft, unauthorized access, and conspiracy. Sterling stood up and sighed, a sound of weary patience. Your Honor, he said, his voice rich and soothing, this is not a criminal case. This is a family tragedy. We have here a grieving mother and a stepfather who were desperately trying to protect a daughter's future during a mental health crisis. The actions described by the state, the access attempts, these were simply efforts to consolidate family accounts that had been shared for years. It was clumsy, perhaps, but it was not criminal. It was love. I felt a surge of bile in my throat. Love. They were calling the brute force attack on my bank account love. I looked at the jury box. There was no jury for this preliminary hearing. Only the judge. She was listening, her face unreadable. Then the evidence began. Mr. Kinsinke did not start with the emotional stuff. He started with the math. He called the first witness, a digital forensic specialist from the police department. They projected the timeline onto the screen in the courtroom. Can you explain this log? Detective Kincaid asked. This is a server log from the victim's bank, the specialist said. It shows 52 login attempts in the span of 4 minutes. 52, Kincaid repeated. Is that consistent with someone trying to remember an old password? No, sir. The specialist said. That is consistent with a dictionary attack. That is someone using software to cycle through common password variations. Sterling tried to object, claiming the software on Grant's laptop was just a password manager malfunction. The judge overruled him. Then came the video. The courtroom lights were dimmed. On the large monitor, the footage from my tree camera played. It was silent, but the silence in the room was heavier. We watched Denise Holloway, the woman in the pastel cardigan, creeping up to the mailbox. We watched her look over her shoulder. We watched her struggle with the lock. We watched her pull at the metal door with a frantic animalistic intensity. Then the split screen appeared. On one side, Denise at the mailbox. On the other, the log of the bank sending the two-factor authentication code. The timestamps matched down to the second. I watched Denise's face in the courtroom. She was not looking at the screen. She was looking at her hands, twisting a tissue into a tight rope. Grant was staring at the monitor, his face flushing a deep mottled red. Next came the phishing email. Kincaid projected the header information. He showed the domain registration. It had been purchased using a credit card linked to Grant's business account. One letter different, Kincaid noted. Wells Fargo instead of Wells Fargo. Mr. Sterling, does love usually involve buying fraudulent domains to deceive family members? Sterling was sweating now. He stood up to cross-examine the detective, but his heart wasn't in it. He tried to argue that Grant bought domains all the time for real estate, that this could have been a parking page for a future project. It was weak. It sounded desperate. Then it was my turn. The state calls Kylie Barnes. I walked to the stand. My legs felt like wood. I swore to tell the truth. I sat down and adjusted the microphone. I looked at Marisol in the gallery. She gave me a barely perceptible nod. Mr. Kinsinke walked me through the events, the meeting at Copper Ash, the threats, the silence, the sudden digital attacks. I answered in short declarative sentences. Did you give your mother permission to access your accounts? No. Did you ask Grant Holloway to help you manage your estate? No. I explicitly told them to communicate only through my attorney. How did you feel when you saw the video of your mother at your mailbox? I paused. I looked at Denise. She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were swimming with tears, begging me to soften the blow, to remember the birthdays, the vacations, the family. I felt confirmed, I said, my voice steady. I realized that the people I thought were my parents were actually social engineers attempting a breach. Sterling stood up for cross-examination. He buttoned his jacket. He approached the stand with a look of pity that made my skin crawl. Ms. Barnes, he said softly, you have been under a lot of strain since your father died, haven't you? Grief is stressful. Yes, I said. And your father? He had a very specific view of the world, didn't he? He was a suspicious man. Did he perhaps tell you that your mother was out to get you? Did he plant these ideas in your head? My father taught me math, I said. He did not plant the keystrokes on Grant's laptop. But isn't it true? Sterling pressed, his voice hardening, that you have always resented your stepfather, that you were jealous of the life they built with your siblings. Isn't this police report just a way to punish them for being happy? I do not care about their happiness, I said. I care about my credit score. You are cold, Sterling snapped, losing his cool for a second. Your mother is sitting there crying and you are talking about credit scores. Do you have no sense of family obligation? Family obligation does not include submitting to fraud, I said. Sterling paused, realizing he had walked into a trap. He had tried to make me look emotional and unstable, but I had given him nothing but concrete walls. No further questions, he muttered. I stepped down. I felt light, empty, and incredibly tired. But the final blow was yet to come. Mr. Kincaid stood up. Your Honor, the state has one final piece of evidence to enter. It is a rebuttal to the defense's claim that the defendants were merely accessing old shared accounts that they believed they had rights to. He held up a document. This is an affidavit from the bank's fraud department. It details the creation date of the account in question. He handed the paper to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. This account, Kincaid said, turning to look directly at Grant, was opened 18 months after the divorce was finalized. It was opened solely in Kylie Barnes's name. And crucially, 3 weeks ago, a customer service call was logged. The room went silent. The caller identified himself as Mr. For answer, Kincaid said, he claimed to have forgotten the password. When the security representative asked for the verbal passphrase, the caller guessed Miller. The correct passphrase was Blue Submarine. The caller then became abusive and hung up. Kincaid paused for effect. We have the audio recording of that call. He pressed a button on his laptop. Grant's voice filled the courtroom. It was unmistakable. It was the same booming, arrogant voice that had demanded I sign the papers at the restaurant. Look, I don't have time for this nonsense. Just reset the damn thing. I am her father. The recording clicked off. I am her father. Kincaid repeated. Grant Holloway is not and has never been Kylie Barnes' father. And he certainly is not Mr. Barnes. The defense table was a portrait of defeat. Sterling closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. Denise had stopped crying. She was staring at Grant with a look of horror, not because of what he did, but because he had been caught so stupidly. Grant was staring at the table, his face gray. The old shared account defense had just been incinerated. You cannot claim you thought you had authorized access to an account where you impersonated a dead man to try to reset the password. The judge looked up from the documents. Her face was no longer unreadable. It was severe. This court has heard enough for a preliminary finding, she said, her voice cut through the air like a gavel strike. She looked at Denise and Grant. The defense's narrative of a misunderstanding is entirely inconsistent with the evidence presented. A misunderstanding is trying a key in the wrong door. This was picking the lock, breaking the window, and lying to the police about living there. She shuffled her papers. I am binding this case over for trial on all charges. And Mr. Sterling, I suggest you advise your clients that family is not a legal defense for identity theft. The hearing was over. The beef moved to stand behind Grant and Denise. I stood up. I watched them. They did not look like my parents anymore. They looked like two people who had bet everything on a bluff and lost. Denise looked at me across the aisle. For a second, I thought she might scream. I thought she might yell that I was an ungrateful brat. But she didn't. She just looked at me with a terrifying blankness. The mask had not just slipped. It had dissolved. There was no affection, no anger, just a calculation that had resulted in an error. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was bright and noisy, filled with people living their own dramas. I took a deep breath. The air still smelled of floor wax. But for the first time in months, I did not feel the weight of the invisible contract. Marisol walked beside me. You know what just happened? She asked. They are going to trial, I said. More than that, she said. You just proved that biology is not a binding contract. I nodded. I checked my phone. There were no new texts, no missed calls, just a notification from my security app. System armed, all sensors normal. It is over, I said. Not quite, Marisol said gently. Now comes the sentencing and the fallout. But yes, the war is over. You won. I did not feel like a winner. I felt like a survivor, of a natural disaster. My house was still standing, but the landscape around it had been stripped bare. I walked out into the Charlotte sun, ready to see what the world looked like when you were finally truly alone. And for the first time, being alone didn't scare me. It felt like safety. The courtroom was silent, but it was not the empty silence of a void. It was the heavy vibrating silence of a pendulum that has reached the top of its arc and is about to swing back with crushing force. Judge Thorne sat behind the bench, looking over her reading glasses at the defense table. She had spent the last hour reviewing the exhibits, the video of the mailbox, the server logs, the forged notary stamp, and the recording of Grant screaming at the bank representative. When she finally set the papers down, the sound echoed like a gunshot in the room. In 20 years on the bench, Judge Thorne began, her voice low and devoid of any theatrical anger. I have seen strangers rob strangers. I have seen employees embezzle from employers. But rarely have I seen a case where the perpetrators use the intimacy of a family bond as a lockpicking kit. She looked directly at Denise. Mrs. Holloway, your defense counsel argued that your actions were motivated by maternal concern. He argued that you were trying to protect the estate. Denise nodded eagerly, a flicker of hope lighting up her eyes. She was still trying to work the room, still believing that her tears had currency here. However, the judge continued, her voice turning to steel. Concern does not require a fake notary stamp. Protection does not involve purchasing a fraudulent domain name to phish your daughter's banking credentials, and love does not require a confession of judgment signed in a soundproof room. Denise's nod froze. The court finds that there was a clear, coordinated intent to defraud Ms. Barnes. You assumed that because you knew her social security number and her mother's maiden name, you had a right to her assets. You believe that biological proximity gave you permission to bypass the law. The judge leaned forward. Let me be very clear. Knowing someone's password is not a license to use it. Knowing where someone lives is not an invitation to pry open their mailbox. You treated Ms. Barnes not as a family member, but as a compromised server to be exploited. I sat at the prosecution table, my hands folded in my lap. I did not feel triumph. I felt a profound sense of relief, like a fever breaking after a long illness. Please stand for sentencing, the judge ordered. Grant and Denise stood up. Grant looked like a man who was watching his own funeral. Denise looked shaky, leaning heavily on the table. For the charge of conspiracy to commit identity theft and attempted fraud, the judge announced, I am sentencing both defendants to 24 months of supervised probation. Any violation of the law during this period will result in immediate incarceration. She paused. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay restitution for Ms. Barnes's legal fees in the amount of $18,500. This is to be paid within 60 days. Grant flinched. I knew their finances. $18,000 was a significant hit, especially with the boat being sold. But the judge was not done. Mr. Holloway, she said, shifting her gaze to Grant. This court is also forwarding a certified copy of these proceedings, specifically the findings regarding your purchase of the fraudulent domain and your impersonation of a deceased man to the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. Grant's face went the color of ash. This was the kill shot. A criminal record for fraud is a death sentence for a licensed broker. He was not just losing money. He was losing his identity. He was losing the suit, the image, the big man persona he had constructed. And regarding Mr. Carter Baines, the judge added, glancing at the file where Carter's name appeared, the court is issuing a bench warrant for his arrest for the unauthorized practice of law. Your association with him is noted in your permanent record. Then the judge turned to the matter of the protective order. I am granting the plaintiff's request for a permanent restraining order, she ruled. This order is effective immediately and will remain in force for 10 years. 10 years. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. This order prohibits you from coming within 500 ft of Ms. Barnes's residence or place of employment. It prohibits you from contacting her by phone, email, text, or social media. It prohibits you from contacting her through third parties. The judge looked sternly at Denise. That means no letters sent through aunts or cousins, no messages passed through siblings. If you attempt to circumvent this order, you will be arrested for a Class A1 misdemeanor. "Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Grant whispered. Denise did not answer immediately. She was staring at me, her eyes wide, as if she could not believe that the state of North Carolina was actually telling her she could not speak to her own daughter. "Mrs. Holloway," the judge prompted. "I understand," Denise choked out. "Good," the judge said. She started to gather her files, but then she paused. She looked at Denise one last time. "One final question, Mrs. Holloway, before I dismiss this court." Denise looked up. "In the testimony regarding the meeting at the restaurant, the judge said you claimed you wanted MS. Barnes to sign the power of attorney because you wanted things to be fair for the family. You used that word multiple times. Fairness." The courtroom was pin-dropped silent. If she had signed that paper, the judge asked, her voice deceptively mild, if she had given you control of her finances that night, would you have told her about the notification you received when you tried to hack her bank account 3 days later? Or was fairness just the word you used to hide the theft? Denise opened her mouth to speak. She wanted to spin it. She wanted to say something about how she would have managed it better, how she would have invested it, but she couldn't. The logic was a trap she had built herself. If she said yes, she admitted to the hack. If she said no, she admitted to the deceit. She closed her mouth. She looked down at the floor. The silence that stretched between us was the only honest thing she had given me in years. "That is what I thought," the judge said. "Case closed." The gavel came down. I stood up. Marisol turned to me and offered a hand. Her grip was warm and solid. "It is done," she said. "You are free." I signed the acknowledgment of the order at the clerk's desk. The pen was a cheap plastic ballpoint with the county seal on it. It was light, nothing like the heavy Mont Blanc they had tried to force into my hand at the restaurant. I looked at the pen in the restaurant. The pen had been a weapon. Here it was a tool. I asked the clerk if I could keep it. She looked surprised, but she shrugged and said, "Go ahead, honey. We have boxes of them." I slipped the pen into my blazer pocket. It would sit there right next to my heart, a reminder that my signature belonged to me and no one else. I walked toward the exit. I had to pass the defense table to leave. Grant was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, likely calculating how he was going to explain this to the licensing board. Denise was standing clutching her purse. As I walked past her, I did not look at her face. I looked straight ahead at the exit sign, glowing red above the double doors. But I heard her. I heard the sharp intake of breath. I heard the scuff of her heel on the linoleum as she turned toward me. "Kylie," she whispered. It was reflexive. It was the sound of a woman who still believed she could talk her way out of consequences. She took a step toward me. I stopped. I did not turn around. I just waited. I heard her second step falter. She had remembered the restraining order was not just a piece of paper. It was a tripwire. If she took one more step, if she said one more sentence, she would be violating her probation 5 minutes after it started. The bailiff was standing 10 feet away, watching her with his hand resting on his belt. The silence behind me was absolute. She was frozen by the reality of the law, the manipulation, the guilt trips, the "but I am your mother" arguments. They all died right there on the courtroom floor, killed by a court order that said no. I started walking again. The sound of my heels on the floor was steady. Click, click, click. It was the rhythm of a person moving forward. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the hallway. The air in the courthouse was recycled and stale. Then as I walked toward the main entrance, the glass doors opened and the humidity of the North Carolina afternoon hit me. It was hot. It was sticky. The traffic outside was loud. It was beautiful. I reached into my pocket and touched the cheap plastic pen. For my entire life, I had been told that my legacy was what I owed to others. I was told that my value was in being the good daughter, the reliable sister, the safety net for people who refused to build their own. My parents had tried to steal my father's money, but what they really tried to steal was my autonomy. They wanted the inheritance. But as I walked down the concrete steps, squinting into the sun, I realized they had given me a much greater inheritance than the one in the index funds. They had taught me how to fight. They had taught me that I could stand in a room alone, count to 5, and walk away. The money would grow. The house in Matthews would be sold. Sienna would eventually leave that toxic house, and I would be there to help her when she did on my terms, not theirs. But the real legacy was the silence behind me. The legacy was the ability to draw a line in the sand and say, "This is where you stop." I took the pen out of my pocket and twirled it between my fingers. I was Kylie Barnes. I was 29 years old, and for the first time in my life, the page in front of me was completely blank, and I was the only one holding the pen. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It was a long journey for Kylie, but she finally found her freedom. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from a busy city, a quiet town, or maybe while you are working remotely like Kylie? Please leave a comment below and let's get a conversation going. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more dramas about justice and resilience, please subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this video get discovered by more people. Your support means the world to us. Stay safe and remember to always read the fine print. Thanks to all.